I've never said this out loud with my real name attached to it, so, William, will have to do. People usually imagine criminals as reckless, angry, greedy in obvious ways. That wasn't me. I was 29, wearing pressed shirts, answering emails, and spending most afternoons pretending to understand invoices in a logistics office where nobody noticed me unless something went wrong. I wasn't broke exactly, but I was drowning in the kind of quiet debt that doesn't make noise until it starts swallowing your sleep. Late rent. My mother's medical bills. A credit card balance that grew every month no matter how carefully I counted. The strange part is that I didn't start by wanting to steal. I started by noticing something. My job put me in the middle of small business transactions, vendors, clients, transfers, confirmations. I wasn't the person signing anything important. I wasn't the accountant. I wasn't management. I was what people call administrative support, which really meant I moved information from one inbox to another. Invisible. Replaceable. The kind of person people forget is even there. And that's where it hit me. Everybody watched the money. Nobody watched the messenger. That phrase sat in my head for weeks. At first it was just curiosity. I started seeing patterns. Who approved what? Which suppliers got paid without question? Which managers skimmed emails instead of reading them? Which transfers were so routine that nobody looked twice? The whole thing felt less like a locked vault and more like a hallway full of half-open doors. I remember the exact moment it stopped being abstract. It was a Thursday evening. I was alone in the office because quarter end always meant everyone left late except the people who mattered, and I definitely wasn't one of them. Rain hitting the windows. Fluorescent lights buzzing. I was forwarding payment confirmations when I noticed a vendor thread with 3 people copied in, and not one of them had actually checked the account details in the attachment. Not one. I stared at that screen for maybe a minute. My heart started beating in a way I can still remember. I didn't do anything that night. I want to be honest about that. I just shut the laptop, walked home in the rain, and tried to convince myself I was only tired. But once you see a weakness, you can't unsee it. That was the beginning of neviditelny spostredkovital, the invisible intermediary. Transactions nobody saw. And before long, I started wondering what would happen if the person carrying the message decided to change it. I told myself for almost 3 weeks that I was only studying the system. That was the lie that made it feel harmless. Every morning I arrived a little earlier than everyone else. The office was different before 8, quiet, humming, almost intimate. I started paying attention to habits. Who skimmed attachments? Who answered from phones during meetings? Which supplier names were familiar enough that nobody questioned them? Patterns matter more than passwords. People trust what looks routine. I kept notes, but never on company devices. Just fragments in a cheap paper notebook I carried in my jacket. Payment dates. Invoice formats. Which manager signed off fastest on Fridays? The more I watched, the more invisible I felt. Not hidden, ignored. There's a difference. The plan formed slowly. I didn't want a huge transfer. Big numbers attract panic. I wanted something small enough to disappear inside normal business noise. A fraction of a monthly payment, redirected once, explained later as a clerical correction. That was when curiosity became intention. And honestly, that realization scared me more than the crime itself. Preparation turned into ritual. I bought a second-hand laptop with cash at a flea market across town. No account linked to my name, no familiar browser history, nothing that could accidentally connect back to me. Then I rented a mailbox using a shortened version of my middle name. That part made my hands shake. It was the first real-world step, the first moment it stopped living only in my head. The account was harder. I needed somewhere money could land without looking like it landed with me. I found a tiny consulting shell registered months earlier by a friend of a friend who never used it. On paper it looked boring, forgettable, legitimate enough to survive a glance. I studied old invoices until I could copy their rhythm without thinking, font, spacing, reference numbers, even the polite wording in the footer. I practiced changing account details so carefully that the document looked untouched. Every night I asked myself whether I was actually going through with it. Every morning I kept preparing. The day I chose wasn't random. It was the last Friday before a holiday weekend, when half the office was already mentally gone. People were talking about trains, family dinners, weather. Nobody was thinking about invoice verification. I waited for a supplier we paid every month, nothing dramatic, just a routine logistics contractor. Their invoices were always around the same amount, always approved quickly because everyone recognized the name. That predictability was the whole point. Around 4:20 in the afternoon, I forwarded the thread exactly as I'd seen it done 100 times before. Same subject line. Same tone. Same attachment, except for one line of bank details. I even added a casual sentence about wanting the payment processed before the holidays so they wouldn't be delayed. My finger hovered over send longer than I expected. Then I clicked. Nothing happened. That was the strangest part. No alarms. No calls. No sudden catastrophe. Just the soft whoosh of an email leaving my outbox while someone behind me laughed about weekend plans. My pulse felt loud enough to fill the room. The next 2 days were unbearable. I checked my phone so often the battery barely lasted until evening. Every vibration felt like the beginning of collapse. I kept imagining the supplier calling, somebody opening the attachment again, somebody finally noticing the account number was different. By Saturday afternoon I had convinced myself it was over. Then Sunday night I logged into the account. The transfer had arrived. I actually stared at the screen for a full minute because my brain refused to accept what I was seeing. It wasn't some enormous movie-style jackpot. Just enough to make my rent, erase the card debt, and keep my mother's treatment moving another month. Ordinary money. That almost made it more surreal. The first thing I felt wasn't triumph. It was disbelief, followed by a wave of adrenaline so sharp it made me nauseous. My hands went cold. And then came the dangerous thought. It worked. Not. I stole. Not. I crossed a line. Just those 2 words. It worked. That was the moment I became more afraid of myself than of getting caught. Monday morning was worse than the waiting. I walked into the office convinced everyone could see it on my face. The receptionist said good morning, and for a second I thought her voice sounded different, suspicious somehow. That's what fear does, it turns ordinary things into signals. Around 11, I heard my manager call the supplier's name from across the room. My stomach dropped so hard I had to grip the edge of my desk. I couldn't hear every word, only fragments. Payment. Friday. Confirmation. My throat went dry. Then he walked over to me. He asked if I had forwarded the invoice because the supplier said the money hadn't appeared yet. That was the first unexpected problem. The holiday weekend had delayed interbank processing. The transfer existed, but they couldn't see it yet. I said yes, kept my voice steady, and opened the email thread with what I hoped looked like harmless confusion. He stood beside me while I clicked through the same message I had altered myself. My pulse was so violent I could hear it. I thought I was finished. He leaned over my shoulder close enough that I could smell coffee on his breath, and asked me to open the attachment. For half a second I genuinely couldn't move the mouse. My hand had gone numb. Then luck, if that's the right word, intervened. His phone rang. He stepped away, muttered something about taking the call, and told me to just send them the confirmation again. That tiny interruption probably changed my life. The second he turned the corner, I moved. I didn't panic outwardly. That's what I remember most. Inside I was collapsing, but my hands suddenly became precise. I reopened the file, restored the original bank details from the supplier's earlier invoice, saved it, and sent the corrected attachment back with a short apology about version confusion. That bought me time. For the next hour I could barely breathe. Every footstep near my desk felt final. Every email notification sounded like accusation. No one said anything? And somehow, that silence felt more terrifying than being confronted. By late afternoon, the supplier confirmed the payment had appeared. That should have calmed me down. Instead, it made everything worse. Now there were two facts in the world at the same time. The company believed the transfer had gone through normally, and I knew the money had already passed through the account I controlled. The gap between those realities felt unstable, like walking across ice that might crack under any step. I couldn't leave the money where it was. That would have been stupid. But moving it felt even more dangerous. I waited until evening and split it into smaller pieces. Some went toward old debts. Some I withdrew in cash over several days from different machines. A little went to my mother's clinic. That part still twists something in me, because paying for something good with stolen money doesn't make it clean. It only makes the guilt harder to sort out. At work I acted normal. Or what I thought normal looked like. Apparently fear has a smell. People kept asking if I was tired. For about 10 days, nothing happened. That was almost enough to convince me I had survived it. I slept again. I laughed at lunch. I even caught myself thinking about what I'd do differently next time, which is probably the ugliest truth in this whole story. Once fear fades, greed starts talking in a calmer voice. Then the supplier called. Not angry. Confused. They said their monthly reconciliation showed a discrepancy. The payment amount matched, but the transfer route looked unusual in their records. I didn't understand the technical details then, something about intermediary routing codes and confirmation timing, but I understood the room immediately. My manager closed his office door. Two people from finance stopped joking. That afternoon, everyone started pulling old email threads. I sat there pretending to work while hearing my own name every few minutes. Not accusations. Just ordinary questions. Did William send this? Was he copied here? That was somehow worse. The office suddenly felt smaller. I realized then that crimes don't really disappear. They stay quiet. Then one day they begin moving toward you. The first direct question came the next morning. My manager asked me to step into the conference room. Finance was there too. No police, no dramatic confrontation, just a printed stack of emails in the middle of the table. That image still lives in my head. Ordinary paper. Ordinary chairs. My heartbeat felt loud enough to shake the glass walls. They weren't accusing me yet. They wanted help reconstructing the timeline. When had I received the invoice? Who asked me to forward it? Did I notice any unusual attachments? Every answer felt like stepping across thin ice. I had already prepared a story without realizing it. I said I probably downloaded 2 versions while clearing my inbox before the holiday. I mentioned how rushed everything had felt. I admitted confusion before they could accuse me of hiding it. That was the strange part. A partial truth makes a lie breathe. They watched me carefully, but nobody pushed harder. When I left that room, my shirt was damp with sweat and my legs felt weak. I knew suspicion had finally entered the building. After that meeting, every hour became performance. I stopped volunteering opinions. I answered only what people asked. I made coffee when I normally wouldn't. I stayed late once, left early once, trying not to suddenly become too careful. That's the absurdity of hiding something. You become hyper-aware of how you breathe, how long you look at a screen, whether silence itself looks suspicious. Finance started checking archived correspondence. That was the part that frightened me most. Deleted files don't vanish the way people imagine. Systems remember timestamps, versions, tiny traces nobody thinks about until they need them. I went home that night and opened the second-hand laptop. For nearly an hour I just stared at it. Then I deleted local files, wiped the drafts, removed old login traces, and shut it down. None of it felt cinematic. It felt pathetic. Small. Like a man cleaning fingerprints from a window while the whole house is already lit. I barely slept. Around 3 in the morning I realized something ugly. I wasn't afraid of prison first. I was afraid of my mother finding out. 3 days later, finance found the version mismatch. They didn't call it fraud. Not yet. They called it an inconsistency in document history. That careful language somehow made it worse. Formal words create distance, and distance makes people colder. My manager asked me back into the conference room. This time there were fewer questions and longer pauses. They showed me 2 attachments side by side. Same invoice number. Same date. Different account details. I remember staring at those pages and feeling something inside me give way. He asked if I could explain it. I tried. God, I tried. I said I might have downloaded a draft. I said the supplier could have sent revisions. I said maybe I forwarded the wrong file under deadline pressure. Every sentence sounded thinner than the one before it. No one argued. That silence was unbearable because I could see it in their faces. They no longer believed me, but they were waiting to see whether I would keep lying. When I walked out, I already knew the story was collapsing. I just didn't know how fast. They suspended me the following morning. Not publicly. My manager called me in before most people arrived. Human Resources was there. They said they needed access to my workstation, company phone, and building badge while the internal review continued. The language was careful, almost polite, which somehow made it feel more humiliating. I handed everything over and signed a document I barely read. Walking out of that building was worse than any interrogation. A few people looked up from their desks. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked questions. That silence followed me all the way to the street. At home, I sat in the kitchen for nearly an hour without taking off my coat. That afternoon my mother called. She asked why I sounded tired. I told her there were staffing cuts and that my department was being reorganized. Even now, that lie hurts more than the money. By evening I knew I had a choice: keep constructing excuses, or finally admit what I had become. I still wasn't sure which one frightened me more. 2 days later, I asked to come back and speak to them. I didn't sleep the night before. By morning I was exhausted in a strangely calm way, like fear had finally burned through itself. When I sat down in that conference room again, I could barely recognize my own voice. I told them the truth. Not every microscopic detail, but enough. I admitted I altered the attachment. I admitted the transfer passed through an account I controlled. I admitted it had not been an accident. Nobody interrupted. My manager looked older than I remembered. Not angry, just disappointed in a way that was harder to endure. Finance asked where the money had gone. I explained that most of it had already been spent on debt, rent, and medical bills. Saying that out loud didn't make me sound noble. It made me sound desperate. They said the company would involve police unless restitution began immediately. Walking home, I felt strangely lighter. Not safe. Not forgiven. Just finished with pretending. And after weeks of panic, that felt almost unbearable in its own way. I wasn't arrested that day. The company agreed to a civil settlement if I repaid what I could and cooperated fully. It took years. I sold almost everything that had value, took contract work wherever anyone would ignore the gap in my employment history, and lived with the quiet humiliation of rebuilding from a hole I dug myself. My mother eventually learned enough to understand there had been trouble at work. I never gave her every detail. Maybe that was cowardice. Maybe mercy. I still don't know. What changed most wasn't my bank account. It was the way I saw myself. For a long time I told myself I was a decent person who made one desperate decision. That's comforting, but incomplete. The harder truth is that I crossed the line gradually, through attention, rationalization, preparation, and then action. By the time I called it desperation, I had already been choosing for weeks. So if you ever find yourself becoming the invisible intermediary, stop early. The first compromise is the real crime. Everything after that just follows it.